Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's contract administration practice session. So with that, I do want to get going with today's session. So I will hand it over to one of our co-chairs, Jim Raines, who is the fearless leader for this multi-part series, and let him get started on today, which we are tackling Chapter 9. So, Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew, and welcome everybody to Chapter 9 of the practice guide, where we are going to talk about executing the work. My favorite part of construction administration, getting started in the field and seeing our dreams come true. So just to reiterate one thing that Matthew said, please raise your hand and participate. It makes these sessions so much better, even if we do have to go over some or split it up, because that makes it rich. So, and perhaps my colleague Doug Freeman will join us at some point today. Doug's had a really busy year, fall and spring, and so he hasn't been able to be on many of these calls, but we look forward to him participating. So, Matthew, if you want to go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about the project work getting started. So here we are in the field, and we've gone through all the process to get started, and it usually begins by, putting some stakes in the ground. So this is critically important, right? We have surveys that have typically been provided by the owner, and we're laying out the project, which usually involves surveyors, the project superintendent or project engineer, perhaps a project manager, getting things laid out in the right place. And it's really important to focus here on getting in the right place, because as everyone knows, from this point forward, any kind of a serious issue is going to have a compounding effect on the project and could start us off in a real mess. So let's go to the next slide, Matthew, and talk about supervision. So at this point, the general contractor for the project, no matter what the delivery method, is taking over and supervising what happens. So they begin to act as the spokesperson for the project. Of course, the architects or engineers of record stay involved, but really the general contractor is now supervising personnel. And it's important that everything that is available to them for the construction of the project is in their hands, and that they're following it, so that they know the contract documents and that they strictly comply with what those documents say. And in those documents are all of the references to particular regulations that they also are aware of and stay on top of, because it is their job to assure that that work in the field is done in accordance with those documents, and also in accordance with what the local authorities having jurisdiction require for the project. So at this point, the contractor is providing everything necessary to put together the project: materials, equipment, as well as all the coordination, sequencing, etc. So it's important that they are a good communicator, that they are diplomatic, but certainly that they have very strong leadership skills. So let's take a look at the next slide. And what the contractor begins at this point is the proverbial herding of the cats. So this is a talent that successful contractors have to keep things, activities aligned and the project running smoothly. So we obviously want to see on our projects contractors that have experience with the project type that we're working on, that they have a strong understanding of the tasks, the sequencing of those tasks, the spatial relationships in what we have designed as engineers and architects, and that they obviously have the plan reading and specification understanding skills, so that they are able to sequence and schedule the work as it needs to occur. And back to communication for a second, we also look for the contractor to have skills in resolving any kind of personnel issues, any disputes or crises that happen with the job, any kind of unknown daily activity that is required. And I touch on this often. You know, there was a time in my professional career where contractors self-performed much of the work on the site. Now that seems less true, and they, as a general contractor, are in more of a financial package and personnel management kind of task. So the sequencing of what these independent subcontractors and material providers do so that it relates to how the project comes together in the proper order is one of the most necessary skills that the contractor brings to the table. So, Matthew, let's look at the next slide for schedules, and I'll stop for a second and see if there are any hands raised.
Not yet. Looks like we might still be herding the cats, taking a call off your phone.
That's right. Well, that's right. Well, so schedule becomes a primary focus immediately before the job even starts, and we've touched on that in pre-construction. But regardless of delivery method, the contractor is responsible for that schedule. So they've got to assure that all of their team members are staying abreast of milestones, that materials are there, personnel are there as they need to be. And this schedule, this tool that they use for the project is certainly something that can be very informative and very important, but it's got to be accurate and it's got to be communicated. So one of those opportunities is at the owner, architect, contractor meetings that happen perhaps weekly, certainly at least monthly on projects where information is shared. And as long as it's accurate, then it is meaningful. And targets are able to be set. Depending on the type of project, you may work on projects where look-ahead schedules are used, where perhaps the next week is planned out before you get together and talk about the schedule again, or perhaps a month ahead. So these are tools that help plan those activities for the contractor and certainly inform us for perhaps submittals, shop drawings, critical involvement that we have with answers or responses to questions. But one of the things that's really important here is that these schedules be kept up to date and that they be accurate. So let's look at the next slide and we'll talk a little more. And I'll skip to the very bottom there. One of the things that we don't ever want to lose is what was the underlying schedule or the original schedule based on our contract agreement. So I spoke about updated schedules, and that's important. As items, perhaps, let's take the high road and say, get started early and get finished early. There's opportunity saved in the job, time saved in the job, available for other tasks or for impacts of bad weather. That's great to have an adjustment and show on the schedule, but what we want to be sure to do is not to lose the original information, because that may become critical later on should the project get behind schedule or should other issues occur with maybe there are problems with the job that might lead to mediation, arbitration, litigation. That original information would be critical to inform how conversations happen in the light of something like that occurring. So when the schedules are prepared, they certainly need to be prepared by knowledgeable individuals, and they need to have accurate information. And as we've talked about, they're not static. They're evolving tools, and we'll use them as we move through the project. So, Matthew, let's take a look at the next slide, and we'll talk about means and methods and see if there are any questions at this point.
Yeah, there's one question that came up actually about a slide and a half ago here. It just says, Your previous slide says abide by AHJ codes. Is it not true that the design team to provide documents that meet the codes? Please differentiate the responsibility between the GCs and the design responsibilities.
Absolutely. The intent of the contract documents, the drawings and specifications is that they should be prepared to meet applicable building codes, and that duty goes to the architect or engineer or the designer, if you will, of record. So absolutely, that code compliance should be in the documents. Also, a requirement for the constructor, for the contractor, general contractor, and the licensed subcontractors is to perform their work according to the codes that are referenced. So it is a responsibility of the architect and engineer to provide a set of documents that meets the code. It is also the contractor's responsibility to meet the code while they are installing that work. And it's their duty to coordinate inspections with those authorities so that those authorities have access to the site to look at and inspect and confirm that, in fact, that work is being installed according to the code. So the general contractor, as often I say in these examples, I talk about the typical design, bid, build method. It would be difficult to cover all the methods, but that's the focus of these presentations. And in that regard, the general contractor is obligated to be sure that those codes are being met. So their subcontractors for electrical work or mechanical work, sure, they are required to do the work in compliance, but it falls to the general contractor to confirm that and to oversee and manage that. And in fact, it is them, it is they that are responsible for the means and methods of the construction, which is what we'll talk about here in a second. I hope I answered that question. Is there another one, Matthew?
No, that was the only one at this moment.
Okay. So, means and methods. As I was just saying, the contractor is 100% responsible for that. So this involves many steps of receiving, installing, protecting, coordinating the materials that are associated with the project. So they've got to be sure the labor is there, that the logistics and the order of the materials is there, that those materials are compliant with our contract documents, and that they be installed in an expeditious manner and also a cost-effective manner to meet the contract documents. So, you know, I like this little note here. The contract documents specify what's going to be constructed and where, but the how is really up to the general contractor, and that responsibility solely rests with them. So how do we help as architects and engineers to be sure that this occurs? Well, contractor has regular progress meetings. We have regular progress meetings. Ours might be with the owner and the general contractor, but theirs are with their subcontractors. And so if we have an opportunity to help with those, it's certainly good to do that. Excuse me. To be able to share information, communicate, and help inform with what's going to happen. And we do that through communications at job site meetings or follow-up reports, phone calls, emails, in today's market, even text. The contractor also has to be sure that they have contingency plans for things that are unexpected. I guess the most obvious one would be weather. So they have a construction end date, and they have taken into consideration normal weather patterns for an area, and they've got to have plans for being able to overcome any impact that they might periodically have in the construction schedule. So these are things that would go into those updates for the project schedule if they do in fact happen and need to be wrapped into the status of or an update for work and where it is. So that's a touch on means and methods. And Matthew, if you will, go to the next slide and we'll start to talk about the pieces and parts of those means and methods. And an early one is, of course, the receipt of materials on the site. So how material is delivered, when, how it's stored, where it's stored, and how it's protected all fall within the contractor's purview and are their responsibilities for all of those things. Of course, they're responsible for inspecting to see if the materials that have been received are in good condition. We, of course, go out to make job site observations. One of our critical involvements with materials on the site is processing pay applications for those stored materials, and we'll talk about that here. What do we need to be concerned with? First, are they stored properly? Did we have laydown areas for the contractor on the drawings, and are they within those bounds and properly stored? If there's equipment necessary to get the materials there, all of that is the contractor's responsibility to arrange, and of course they do. But sometimes we have provisions for off-site stored materials. In the state of North Carolina, that's a rarity, especially for state-owned properties. They want the materials on the site because they want to pay for them on their property. Should something happen on the job and things go badly, then it's easy for them to recover. But sometimes things are stored off-site, particularly if it's a climate-sensitive product or material. And then we need to be involved in seeing those stored materials to be sure that they are properly stored before they're paid for. And all of that storage must be in compliance with the manufacturer's requirements or in our contract documents as we reference how they must be paid and how they must be stored. And the next slide, Matthew, continues about this same topic of the storage of materials. So if we, there's a sequence where the specifications say, here's what the manufacturer requires. And I would suggest that that's the first and most important requirement to be met. Directly behind that and almost first is what our specifications say about the storage of particular material, and then next would be whatever kind of industry standards and or common sense that come along with the storage of material. Products come with material safety data sheets that may speak to storage, or there may be other special instructions that come with the materials as they are shipped to the job. But overall, in our specifications for projects, both in the general information in Part 1 of specifications and in the execution part of specifications, Part 3, there may be other items that speak to the storage of those materials. So I want to stop and see if there are any questions, but before we open the floor for those, I will just suggest to you, we probably, let me say it a different way. Materials storage is something that I find to be lacking as far as meeting what contract documents require often. And I see it with products like building felt, with blue foam insulation. If we go in and study what the manufacturer suggests for particular materials, for example, there are very definite short time limits for exposure to ultraviolet light and the sun. And we fall into a pattern of hearing, well, this is always how we've done it before, or no one has required us to put this in a trailer and I've been building for 50 years kind of conversations. I suggest that we respectfully hear those comments, but in the end, what we need to be doing is having materials be stored as the manufacturer requires and as our contract documents require. And while those might not be fun conversations, they are definitely things that we should enforce. So I'll stop now, Matthew, and see, are there any questions?
There was a comment that came in here to say that material storage on newly constructed slabs should be approved by the structural engineer before a failure can happen.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why this photograph is there. How has it been loaded and what's on there and who's tracking that? Well, probably no one. And that is a great point. Whoever offered that, I really appreciate it, because you can have a situation go very badly if that isn't being managed and watched, and you are exactly right. Well, let's look at the next slide, Matthew, if there are no other questions, and start to talk about how construction begins. From the start, we need to see good work and that it be installed properly, because if we don't have good work, the work that goes on top of it, will turn out being not good work too. And so as a process, when an installer starts on top of a substrate, industry says, and see there I go using that term, industry says that it has been accepted by the party that's building upon it. Well, that's an implication. I've worked on jobs where contractors have forms that specifically say that. A contractor has inspected the substrate, accepts it in its current condition, and agrees that it will allow them to do their further work in accordance with the contract documents. Again, means and methods as a general contractors, but those are the kind of things that you like to see because they give you an understanding that this contractor really is actively involved in the means and methods and in the management of the quality of the work that they're going to do. So they're making close observations about level, plumb, square, whether things are in line, and verifying that as a quality assurance process before further construction happens on it. So those are things that we like to see on a job, and if there's an opportunity or a request that people gather and personnel look at the schedule and assure that things are in compliance, then that's a good thing to see your contractor doing, and I don't think it hurts at all to be there and be a party to that, so that we are aware as engineers and architects what the next steps are going to be on the project. So Matthew, let's take a look at the next slide. In the installation and preparing for work, often there are erection installation methods that sometimes involve a good bit of work themselves. So I'll tell you, this is a project that is across the street from where I work, and it was an event to attend. This dome had been under construction on the ground for about 4 months. The contractor decided that it would be less expensive and more expeditious to build the dome on the ground and then pick the dome up and set it on the building. And so I would guess there were probably 1,000 people out to watch this happen. It was a great marketing opportunity for the contractor, for the church, for many of the people in the community related to the project. And so sometimes the installation or the execution of the work can turn into other things. There was meticulous planning for this, to build a pad for the crane to sit on, So there was a lot of engineering, structural, and site work that went into how this dome was going to be lifted and placed. And all of that, again, was the general contractor's responsibility to arrange for. And all the parties that were associated with the project, both off-site and local traffic and personnel on the site, were involved in the planning process. And it was effectively executed and finished, and then became, of course, a part of the permanent structure. But so this campus area was involved in the planning. I would say there were probably 100 people at the planning session to see this all laid out and what was going to happen. So means and methods, general contractor, but they involve so many people related to the project. And if we go to the next slide, we'll continue to talk about those installation and application method.
Yeah, we have a comment and a question. I guess two comments really that came in here. One from Doug stating material storage should also be integrated into the overall safety plan for a project. And then Mark commented here that the structural engineer may believe approving early loading of slab as having to do with the means and methods. This will need to be discussed with the SE as well.
I agree with both of those, absolutely. And, you know, safety of stored materials is a very big deal, not only for, well, as we were talking about loading of a slab, but and structural issues, but also just foot traffic, construction workers, visitors on the job site. So you're absolutely right. So the specifications speak to sequencing of the work, particularly in the execution parts of the written word there in the specifications. Much of this is done to industry standards, and references for those standards or the manufacturer's standards are included there. Those are important for us to understand and to know. Before we make site observations, we should be aware of the work that's going on, and we should be knowledgeable of what our specifications say in relation to that work. Certainly informs what we should go out and see in the field while we're on a job site. And so site observations involve, in my opinion, a lot of preparation that often is missed. And folks go out to take a few photographs and write a report and check that off for the week, when what I think is missed is a real opportunity to converse and be able to assist the team in the construction of the project. Not in means and methods, but certainly when we're making informed site visits, we're I think acting in a more professional fashion. So we are able to assist perhaps in things that we have seen in our study in preparation of that and offer to the contractor for their installation. We do that with pre-installation meetings so that we are able to see perhaps mock-ups of certain materials and make comments about the aesthetic nature, color combinations, and or concerns about teams and who's installing what. So those are required often in specifications, and we should participate in those whenever we do require them. But there are a lot of things we want to know that go along with that, and that certainly is the team experience of the people that are going to be working on the job, that they understand the installation requirements, that they are familiar with the materials, that they have in fact accepted substrates that they're going to apply their work to, that the tolerances that are there that they are going to accept are in fact accepted by them, and that they do meet standards if we have reference to particular industry standards or manufacturer standards. So that the work, again, that is being put in place is going to end up being good work because it was placed on good work. And we want to see that the contractor is inspecting the site and being sure that these kinds of things are occurring and happening. It is, in fact, their responsibility. So let's look forward to the next slide and look at some of the things that come along with post installation or as installations are occurring and some other activities. And one of those that's very important is the cleaning of the site, not just the outside, but the pieces used for construction. So, first of all, I've had a lot of mentors in my career, and I'm very fortunate in that regard to have spent some time on sites with some superintendents that had been in the business for decades and decades and decades. And it's always interesting to me to see a job site. You almost can walk on the site and start to understand the quality of the management personnel because of the organization and the cleanliness of it. Certainly those that have been in the business or have paid attention and learned well know that a clean site and an organized site is safer, and it also helps to build momentum for the job and allows many things to go well, whether it's foot traffic across the site or some kind of equipment traffic around the site. And that's always encouraging for me to see, because I know someone is involved that knows what they're doing. So the delivery type, as we've talked about, design, bid, build, is what these are based on. But in some occasions with different delivery types, then there may be other people involved in some of these responsibilities. But typically it's a general contractor. And their cleanup most often is daily, but at least weekly. And certainly after phases of work that create a lot of debris, for example, drywall hanging might be something where there's a certain focused effort on cleanup after an activity is finished. And, we all work on sites that now are very focused on recycling and waste reduction. And so it's important that we see the contractor managing that part of the project, especially if your project is after some type of certification. Then that has become a focus that often we are involved in monitoring, and not as a responsible party, but certainly in seeing that it's done. Because if it's not done properly, then that may impact the owner's ability to have something certified. And it certainly would impact them on, as often our contracts say, excuse me, the owner has the right to clean up a project, so they may need to withhold funds to do that. So, excuse me, there may be opportunities that we see on sites that we need to let our clients know about that they may have to undertake. So, our waste management plans, and I won't go through this entire list, but they have become primarily important on job sites, and there are certain measures that must be taken to afford certifications, and we need to see that the contractors are doing that on a procedural basis. Many of them have particular individuals assigned to that from the general contractor's office and have a reporting responsibility to us as the project moves forward. And so then in the end, there's the construction waste cleaning, but then there's that final spit shine that is the final clean before the project is turned over to the owner. And then, Matthew, unless there are any questions, let's look at the next slide. Once things are totally clean.
Yeah, there's one question. Let me know if it makes sense to you, or I might have to ask for some clarification. It says, when do Part 3 specs risk become means and methods?
Well, gosh, I'm not sure I can answer that. I think that the Part 3 execution is based on what the manufacturer requires for an installation of a material. So I think for the particular material that is specified, we're probably pretty safe that we're not getting into means and methods. I can see, though, and it's a great question, where when we're combining specification sections, so the execution of the curtain wall is here, the execution of through-wall flashing is here, and what if those two things don't marry up and like to be living beside each other? That's a good question, and I think that most probably those products have in fact gone through that combination of life together as they end up in a final constructed wall section, and so we aren't really taking on any means and methods directions when we are quoting those execution sections.
So Ronald did give a clarification as an example here to make sure we're all on the same page here. He says reference code required nailing patterns, but not specifically 8-penny nails 6 inches on center each way.
Right. So then there is that obligation for us to specify a complete system, and we would have to have the engineer's input or our input into what that specific attachment or attaching device, whether it's nail or screw, should be. I've worked on projects, in fact, where engineers discovered that the manufacturer's data was too lenient, I'll say, in a high wind zone. And in fact, the manufacturer's data should have required more substantial fastening, and in fact, they required that. That was all done before the project was bid, and just because this individual had knowledge of the high wind area and that I just described being an issue sometimes. So you raise a good question in that, and I guess, there are little cracks and crevices everywhere that we might stump our toe in that could get into the means and methods. But I think that for the most part, when we refer to local code, manufacturer's requirements, and manufacturer's requirements for installation, then we probably are steering clear of most of the means and methods kinds of issues. I'm not sure if that addressed it appropriately enough, but if not, then ask Matthew a follow-up and I'll try again.
So we did have a second comment that came in from a different person, just saying, as a comment to Part 3, coordination of two separate spec sections and between two separate kinds of materials is typically the GC's responsibility. GC's in turn turn to manufacturers for guidance.
Well, that's a good point. That certainly is part of the specifications and references to manufacturer's requirements, and we show them together in a wall section in a blown-up detail. So we're putting those systems together in our documents as well. Well, let's take a look at the next slide, Matthew, and you tell me if there are any other things. We spoke of the spit shine, and that's great. How many times have you walked into a project and seen muddy boot prints across your new carpet? It just happens too often, and there is a phase of protecting the installed and cleaned work when we have to see contractors go back in. So when it's finished, and that means finished, and that means that it's important to everyone to protect. So If there are protective wraps, that's one way. Again, it's the contractor's responsibility, but we've got to speak to that as we see things happening, or importantly, if we're seeing things not happen. So if there's not protection, if areas that are finished can be locked off, then that should be good. If the owner needs to take possession of some areas and close them off to the contractor, that too happens sometimes. And then when substantial completion occurs and we do an inspection, then it becomes the responsibility of the owner and not the contractor. So when we do a substantial completion inspection and we turn that work over to the owner, we need to be sure that it really is substantially complete, that it's clean and it's ready for the owner to use for its intended purpose. And then the owner may take steps to protect some finishes as well. So the next slide, I want to continue talking about protection, but this sort of jumps backwards a little bit. When we talked about roles and responsibilities earlier, we talked about job site safety. In executing the work, the contractor has been responsible for safety and always is, and is totally responsible for it. So the protection of the workers, the surrounding public, any piece or part that project touches is a requirement of the general contractor. And these days they have safety plans, they have typically safety officers, and they have certainly very detailed, organized, safety-focused programs for a site. So, if we look at the next slide, there's a list there that I won't read through of all the things that the contractor is responsible for related to safety. And one of those we touched on, not overloading the structure, but anything that has to do with safeguards in and around the project falls to them. I would say two things about our involvement with job site safety and the safety of the general public. And the first is, when a contractor has a plan and a program, we need to follow it. If they have a required training for entrance into the job site, take the training. If they require cut-resistant gloves, then have cut-resistant gloves. Follow the rules that we expect the contractor to have their subcontractors follow. I think it sets a great example. It informs us what to expect on the job, and it shows that we respect that. And if you're a professional leader on a job site, you should act like that and you should follow the rules. And it sets a great example from the top of the organization. Be sure that your people do that visit the site, all of your consultants. And be sure your owner's doing that. Now, that's not our responsibility, but I'm saying it's just the way to operate as a professional. So that's my first point. My second point is that our involvement with safety becomes a very different thing if we see something on a job site that is dangerous. As my mentor said, if you see someone who is in the path of danger, then you have no choice but to professionally act. So they're deep in an excavation with no bracing or trench protection. Tell them to get out of the ditch because they're in imminent danger. Now, that's drastic because we're involving ourselves in job site safety. At the same time, you're having the superintendent, the project manager, the foreman, whoever is there, involved in that discussion. So if you see something that is putting someone in imminent danger, then professionally you should act. Those are the two things that I would add to our conversation about job site and public safety. Let's take a look at the next slide, Matthew, and touch for a minute on another piece, a little backward look about executing the work on the site, and those are the testing and inspection agencies that might be involved. Our specifications may require, materials or products may require, local municipalities may require, or authorities having jurisdiction may require a series of different kinds of tests. It's the contractor's obligation to coordinate for those to happen at the appropriate time, whether it's in the building or on the site. Typically, the owner pays for these because that allows the testing to be held sort of at arm's distance from the contractor, and it gives us a comfort level that if something is found to not be compliant, the testing company will point it out. So typically, in our area, the owners pay for these, but the contractor is obligated to schedule for them and have them held when they are required, and be responsible for notifying people to be on the site when they need to be for the sequence of the work. It becomes a part of the means and methods of the job. Let's take a look at the next slide and see if anybody has any questions at this point. Matthew?
Yeah, there were a couple that have started to pop up here. One of them from Hassan, I was holding off because I knew we were getting to the slide we just finished here, but he was saying to ensure the complete inspection, the sub-complete inspection is seamless. It's important to discuss the GC's QA/QC program. So just wanted to add that into what we were just talking about.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Let me say something about that. I think that's a great point, and I try to talk about opportunities to create your team. This is one of those opportunities. So in the pre-construction phase, we talked about this, but definitely now we're into the throes of the job and there are things that need to be tested. Having that conversation, fussing in a positive way about how the contractor clearly has a QA/QC process and how happy you are to see that, and having the authorities that have jurisdiction and having the owner's testing agency at the table to see and hear a conversation specific to their work, I think makes them both feel a part of the team and that what they do is relevant and important and critical to the end result. And I have found that to be extremely useful in just respecting people for the talent and the profession that they bring to the table. So that's a great point, and it does fall to the contractor, but it also is very informative when you see them doing this, that you feel like there is a focus on QA and QC.
All right, we had a couple of other questions or comments really that came in here from Dean. He has, I have found that using due diligence and reasonable person to be a key in avoiding litigation. So essentially a recommendation for some wording that might get you out of tricky spots. And also he points out here that a good project schedule will highlight testing and inspection as part of it. So
absolutely.
A reminder for both of those from Dean. Yep.
Yeah. That's a great point.
And then we had another comment that came in here from Hassan saying in public projects, the POR has an obligation to address safety measures during their field visits. Apologize, I'm not quite sure if POR is an acronym for something I'm aware of.
I'm not sure what that is either. I apologize too. You're right. Testing, great to see it on a schedule, and it lets you know that the people that are the general contractor is planning thoroughly and planning well when they schedule for that. Well, let's go to the next slide, Matthew, and we'll hear.
He responded back. POR in his case is professional of record. So.
Okay, gotcha. Well, speaking of records. Here we are at another opportunity for the contractor to manage the means and the methods in executing the work, and that is to keep a record of what is going on. And I'm not going to read through all of this, except to say that it's obvious that a daily recording of what's happening on the job is critical. You'd love for it not to matter at all, and for it to be a great pile of documentation that goes into the file cabinet, because that means the job went well and there are no arguments and there is no litigation, and you're moving on to the next project and hopefully have a repeat customer, a happy client, and a contractor and a design firm that made money. And that's what we hope for. But in cases where that doesn't happen and there is some follow-up or there are issues, something to manage, either mediate, arbitrate, litigate, these records are really important. And I often see contractors who aren't doing this. They're not filling out information on a daily basis. They're not marking up their record drawings, which will take us to the next next couple of slides. But Matthew, let's take a look at the next slide, because these are examples of what we should be seeing in relation to the records. You know, who's there? What's the weather? What are they doing? In specifics. These are out of the practice guide. I know you can't read them, but suffice it to say there's hourly documentation of what's happening. Well, you can't fill this out on Friday before you go home when you're in a hurry to leave the site. These are things that need to be happening on a daily basis, and something that you will want to see your superintendent or foreman on the job doing. So I try to, at my weekly visit, take a look at these and just say, hey, you know, can you show me what went on this week? I'm just curious. Maybe I missed something. I'd like to sit down and look at your daily reports. Some contractors keep journals. Some construction companies require that. Some litigation is happy to see that pages can't be removed, or if they are, you know, there was something wrong. So they like to see bound daily reports. It doesn't matter what the form, as long as they're being done and that they're done accurately. And along with those reports, if we go to the next slide, one of the things that we also want to see them doing is keeping up with record drawings or record documents. So they're marking up what's been moved, where it is now. This also is something that's got to be happening on a daily basis. You can't wait till Friday to come up with this and try to remember. And I've seen so many occasions where documents that had been marked up were used for the next project, and because they were accurate, it was a wonderful experience. Also, I've had the other happen where the record documents were not right and things were in places where they were drawn and that's not where they ended up, and it caused real problems. So this is, again, something the general contractor is responsible for, but it's something that we can watch, that we can help our client receive in the end. So, you know, were there changes? Did we issue supplementary instructions? Were there change orders? Is this a piece of work that's been changed? Sometimes you see that the superintendent is using something that's out of date and is not using the most current or currently issued or updated drawings. You want to see those taped down and crossed out and on the set of documents that are being used on the site. So, you know, once again, this is something that falls to the general contractor's duties and parts of means and methods, but it's also something that we need to keep a check on for our client and verify that it's happening. And then the next slide is the last one, and then I'll stop for questions to catch up, is on job sites that have offices, we want to see that there's a filing system in place, that not only are there reference materials for the requirements, the standards that we have referenced for ANSI or other kinds of documents, but we also want to see that they are keeping up with the project records and project information. So if there are shop drawings and submittals and there are pay requests that they need to inform and create the next one, then all of that information is available on the site. So record documents, daily reporting, and the filing and maintaining of all that information in the trailer is critically important. for the superintendent to have access to, and for us and our client to have access to review and inspect the job. So I'll stop there, Matthew, and see if there are any questions. And I think that was the last of our slides under executing the work.
It is indeed. So you literally timed this out perfectly. So good job with that, Jim. But we did have 2 comments came in here, and then obviously any of you in the audience that would like to join in, please do so. Coming in from Hassan here again. Projects today are being documented with video and photos. So how is this taking over for built documents? So I know you and Doug both have strong opinions on photographing on the job site. So I will let you go with that for a few moments while I get the next statement ready to go as well.
Sure, I think you're right. Time-lapse photography, particularly drones, and how that's informing what's happening. It's a great point. It is creating a lot of documentation. And the way I like to look at it is twofold. One, if that is being turned over to the owner for future use and what they want to go back and use to manage the building, I think that's great. If all of that is happening with the general contractor, I think that's great. If the owner is hiring it done just from curiosity purposes, I think that's great. As the architect or engineer of record for a project, I would not do that. And I'll tell you why, and it's a simple statement from Doug, our attorney and architect friend and co-presenter. If you take photographs, then you need to know each and every single thing that you're capturing in that image, because you are recording it. And in the process of recording it and including it in a site observation and in a report to the parties to the contract, you're documenting what's in place. And what happens is, if you're documenting something that doesn't meet the contract document, courts of law have said, wait a second, you should have caught this. Wait a second, your license requires that you notify the owner and you notify the contractor if you know something is amiss, and clearly it's amiss because you captured it here in your photograph. I know that's jumping through a lot of information quickly, but Doug's assessment is that if you photograph it, you need to know everything that's captured in the image and speak to anything that is not in compliance. So you don't take broad range photographs, you take very specific photographs of exactly what you're trying to document. That's his encouraging word that I'll offer in his absence. And if you take pictures, then include them in your site observation reports. And if they were taken for just general reasons and you're not using them, then delete them and get them out of your records. Because if you take that image, then you should share it. If you don't share it, then again, in the legal system, they have said, well, obviously you knew something was amiss in this photograph, and that's why you didn't share it, which of course is not the case. But that's the implication when you don't share that information. So thank you, Matthew, for setting me up to rant off there. I'm sorry that takes us over the time, but I wanted to share it.
No problem. There's one more comment and a question. So I'm going to do the question first, which relates to what we were just talking about. Would you be willing to write up the advice on photographic documentation so that it can be disseminated to our employees who aren't on the call today?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you will send that as an email request to Matthew, and Matthew send it to Doug and I, yep. I'm sure Doug would be glad to do that. Absolutely.
And I've already got the email, so no problem. I have already got it, and I will pass it on to both of you and copy the original asker back into the call as well. But then the last comment, then I think we'll have to call it a day here, just comes in. Just says GC's daily report and field reports from the design team should accurately document field instructions. Team should accurately document field instructions are provided. So just another little reminder there that within the reporting to keep that in mind.
Right.
So with that, I thank you all for attending again this month. Next month will also be on the 27th, the one benefit of February being 28 days, as March always has the same days of the week. So we look forward to seeing you then. For those that may be new to this, it is always the fourth Tuesday of the month from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern. So keep an eye on that. The information is already on the CSI website under our events calendar, and you can always go back to look for it there if you don't see it in future emails. But we appreciate you all attending, and Jim, I'll let you close out with anything you'd like to wrap up with or say goodbye.
Absolutely. I just appreciate everybody being here, and I look forward to talking to you again next month. Have a great end of February, and take care.